Good morning. Welcome to day 3 of the festival. I am Amanda Bagdonis. I am the production and operations manager. Thank you for that gentle woohoo in the back. I'm the production and operations manager of Charleston Literary Festival. I understand there's a real buzz in town. We've gotten some great feedback, and in fact, tomorrow night, SCETV will re-air our documentary tomorrow evening at 8 p.m. Thank you, Atomic Focus, for making this happen. We can learn about the history of the festival. First, I'd like to welcome you to the beautiful historic Mills House. It's newly renovated as of December 2022, and it is now the first curio collection by Hilton in South Carolina. You might have noticed, if you've lived here for a while, the extensive renovations wrapped up in 2022. And of course, we are sitting in history everywhere we are in Charleston. This hotel originally opened in 1853, and it has the honor of being Charleston's first structure with both steam heat and running water. So please enjoy today. A quick note on housekeeping: exit doors are behind you, and restrooms with our running water are to your left. The Mills House has partnered with Charleston Literary Festival. They gifted us this space. They have helped promote this event. They understand how important the topic is at hand, and we are so grateful to partner with them. So if you do not have a coffee in your hand or a snack in your lap, I encourage you to take some time afterward to pop by the cafe, grab a drink, stop by the bar, grab something stronger later on today, and please stick around after the session for a Buxton Books pop-up book signing. Before I set the scene, I would love to thank our sponsors, Jerry and Walter Fedorovich. And now to John Wood Sweet. He is an American historian, a professor of history, and the former director of UNC Chapel Hill's program in sexuality studies. We've all learned about our founding fathers, but what about the lives of our ordinary, overlooked people in early America? John Wood Sweet puts them at the center and changes our understanding of the past and of the present. If you've read The Sewing Girl's Tale, it is frustratingly somehow still timely. It focuses on a 17-year-old survivor of a sexual assault. It explores the consequences of braving what virtually no one else dared to do, charging a gentleman with rape. The trial rocked the city and nearly cost Lana her life. And that was not just the start. More than 200 years later, so much has changed, and so much has not. I'd like to share a quote by Katrina Gulliver of the Times of London. We see her by turns, Lana Sawyer, defiant and despondent, and despite much of her life slipping through archival cracks, Sweet makes us care about her pursuit of justice, and how she made it through. John Wood Sweet. And next I'd like to introduce Jennet Robinson Alterman. She has seen enough to know that the Sewing Girl's Tale is not an isolated incident from over 200 years ago. Jennet served as Peace Corps volunteer in Afghanistan, Peace Corps country director in what is now Eswatini, and she was the interagency coordinator for Peace Corps Worldwide in Washington, D.C., working on projects in over 40 countries. Jennet saw again and again, the issues facing women today are not isolated regionally. But when you empower a woman, especially financially, the whole family benefits. As a former director for the Center for Women in Charleston, she focused on helping women start and be successful as small business owners, piloting microloan programs, training and inspiring women to leadership positions, and helping women find new or better jobs through job counseling and training. And a piece that's near and dear to my heart, she then chaired the task force that ultimately created South Carolina's WREN, Women's Rights and Empowerment Network, the leading statewide gender justice advocacy organization in and one of the leading organizations dedicated to gender research, advocacy, and organizing in the nation. I'll leave you, yes. And before I turn it over, I will leave you with this from Katie Simpson Smith from The Story of Land and Sea. As for the Sewing Girl's Tale, urgent and resonant, this book is a reminder that history persists in all of our bodies. Thank you.
You want to just reach in?
All right, well, it's really an honor to be here and to be in such great company. I've been asked to say a few words about the book, so I'm going to do that and then turn things over to Jennet.
Thank you.
So, The Sewing Girl's Tale tells a story that for a long time I thought I understood. And even 230 years later, it seems all too familiar. On a late summer day, a day like today, in fact, a 17-year-old seamstress named Lana Sawyer was making her way down Broadway in New York City when she caught the attention of a group of Frenchmen. They began to catcall her, and she said later that she didn't understand their language, but she knew what they were saying. And at that moment, a young gentleman rescued her. He intervened, he sent the Frenchmen on their way, and he walked her home. And he asked her out for a walk a couple nights later, which she ultimately agreed to do. Finally, he introduced himself as Lawyer Smith. That was not his name. His actual name was Harry Bedloe, but he had already acquired by age 25 a reputation in New York City as a sexual predator, and so he was trying to fly under her radar. New York in this period was like 40,000 people, all living on the very tip of Manhattan Island in about 1 square mile. So it had the atmosphere of a small town. So even if Lana hadn't known him by sight, she very likely would have known him by reputation. A couple evenings later, they went out for their walk, which began innocently enough with a dish of ice cream, some of the first ice cream sold in America, and a walk on the Battery, which had just in the last couple of years been turned into a pleasure ground, a public park. But that evening ended with Lana Sawyer being dragged into the back room of a brothel, kicking and screaming, a brothel run by a woman named Mother Carey. The next morning, Lana Sawyer tried to make sense of what had happened, and as she began to get dressed, she realized that she couldn't leave because her her gown had been torn, and so she sat in this back room alone, sewing her gown back together so she could appear decently on the streets. When she emerged from this back room, the madam, Mother Carey, was standing in this tight little hallway, waiting for her. And Mother Carey underestimated Lana Sawyer. She assumed that Lana, like so many survivors of sexual assaults, particularly acquaintance assaults, would want to slink away in shame and silence, and that she could rely on Lana to do that without causing her or Harry Bedloe any trouble. So she said to Lana, she said, "Dearie, I can let you out the back door, basically so no one will see you, or I can check and see if there's anyone in the street and let you out the front." And Lana said, shockingly, Lana said, "No, I will go out the front door, and I don't care who sees me, even if it's my father." So Lana responded with this kind of flash of anger and this moment of defiance that suggested that first Harry Bedloe and then Mother Carey had misunderstood who she was. They had underestimated her. And in fact, although Lana was reeling throughout that day with trauma and disorientation and struggling to figure out how she was going to talk to her family, her stepfather, for example, even in 1793, had a reputation as an unusually violent man, and she was afraid he would beat her up without listening to her story. She managed to get home and tell her parents what had happened. And within a week, they filed charges of rape against Harry Bedloe. It was the first time a man who was designated as a gentleman, which was a social classification in the city, a legal status. It's the first time in about 50 years a gentleman in the city had been charged with rape. Within a month, there was a trial that was an enormous public spectacle. The courtroom was packed. And after a tumultuous trial, which lasted about 15 hours, in those days they did the trial in one sitting. This trial started about 11 o'clock in the morning, went till 1 o'clock in the morning. The next morning, are you with me? They basically don't stop for dinner. So after, they say it was a 15-hour trial. After this 15-hour trial, the jury deliberated 15 minutes. And I think and the spectators were shocked that the verdict was not guilty. So I first encountered this story when I was in graduate school about a million years ago. This was right after Ms. Magazine in 1986 had coined the term date rape. And that's how I saw it at the time, as a particularly vivid example of an enduring problem. And over the years, I used the published report about this trial, which was the first detailed trial report of a rape case in American history. I used that case in classes to help students understand the origins of modern rape culture. But I didn't really see any contribution that I had to make to our understanding of this story. I had wonderful colleagues who'd written about this case. But then about 15 years ago, a graduate student I was working with, Marin Wood, in the course of her own research, turned up a piece of evidence. And she's like, John, I found this little notice in a New York newspaper in 1798, 5 years after the rape trial. And it was shocking to me because it challenged all of my assumptions about this case. And it made me think, one, I must be a really gullible historian to have read this trial record the way I had for so many years. And it made me curious to know what the real story was. And so I began researching and pulling, and it's like pulling at the yarn in a sweater. It just kept unraveling and unraveling. And the more I found, the stranger the story became, the longer the story went on, the more, in some ways, surprising the story was, and in many ways, the more resonant the story seemed with the present moment. So, at the very least, what I learned was that the verdict in the rape trial wasn't really the end of the story. In many ways, it was just the beginning of the story. Ultimately, this book became for me an opportunity to explore the aftermath of the American Revolution, not through the eyes of some founding father, but through the eyes of a young woman, a 17-year-old, a teenager who had to work as a seamstress in order to help her family make ends meet. A young woman who, if she hadn't responded to this sexual assault in a really unusual way, then, as now, a large majority of acquaintance rape survivors don't make any public report or complaint. That if she hadn't responded to this assault in a really unusual way, we might not know anything about her. She may have, in fact, been lost to the historical record without a trace. But what emerged was the story of this young woman looking to make her own way in a city full of possibility and danger, a story of working men fed up with being disparaged and dismissed by snobbish elites clinging to inherited privileges, a story of early feminists making bold arguments about human rights at a time when the only way an ordinary single woman could make a living without inherited capital was by working as a prostitute. Since this is a literary festival, I I thought maybe I should close by saying a few words about the writing of the book. And I have three little things to say. The first is that I decided to write this book when I was working at UNC as the director of this program in sexuality studies. And at the time, this was, well, I'll just say that at the time, my mind was really focused on the problem of sexual assault on college campuses. And I formed a working group of faculty at UNC and Duke, and UNC Greensboro, and administrators and the directors of the women's centers, et cetera, to try and share perspectives on the problem of sexual assault and to understand why universities in particular have such a hard time making their campuses safe for young women and holding perpetrators accountable. And I ultimately realized that I felt this was a very urgent problem, but that my contribution was going to be historical. And I thought this book would be a way for me to make some contribution to that ongoing discussion. Secondly, this was a moment in my career when I was interested in writing a different kind of book. I had written kind of standard academic books in the past, and I thought I really was interested in writing a narrative, a character-driven story. I wanted people to be able to envision this city 230 years ago. I wanted people to be able to follow Lana's footsteps. I wanted people to be able to get a sense of the textures and the smells and the sights of New York. And that required all kinds of different kind of research than I had been accustomed to. I spent a lot of time researching weather. So I knew if it was raining or not. I wanted to know that, what the sidewalks were like, where the street lamps were, what the pavement was, all these things that otherwise would have seemed very trivial. I spent a lot of time working on what clothing Lana would have been wearing. But I really wanted people to be able to visualize the story so they could get into a story that is so far removed from us in time. Finally, one of the basic challenges in writing a book like this for me was that I really wanted to keep Lana Sawyer at its center. And a lot of the documentary record was written by men operating in male-dominated institutions, concerned mostly about other men. And so finding Lana in the record was a challenge. Keeping her at the center of a story that the men seemed always trying to take over was a challenge. But I think that, writers work within limitations, and sometimes limitations make you more, pull out something from you as a writer. So one of my goals for this book was to make it clear that this was not the event that defined Lana Sawyer's life. This was an event that happened to her, that she had a childhood, she had a backstory, and so I spent a lot of time on her family background and her childhood, researching that, and that this didn't define her life going forward. And even though, as Jennet may point out, we don't know as much about her after story as I would like, I wanted it clear that while she had sustained damage and suffered greatly as a result of what happened, she also managed to piece her life back together. She managed to move on. She managed to build a new life for herself after holding Harry Bedloe accountable. So it's a story about Lana Sawyer's courage, and in a sense, it's a story about the cost of that kind of courage.
And of course, we know a whole lot about Mr. Bedloe.
Yes, we know a lot more about the Bedloe.
Yeah. I have to tell you, I read this book as soon as Diana asked if I would participate, and I finished it, and there was one word that summed it up for me, and that was rage. I could not believe it, but I did believe it. the shocking thing to me, of course, was this was 1793. 2023, we're still dealing with it. And so much of the law, and I know you'll get into this, was really put into place back in that time period, and that's still what we're using, which is crazy. So one of the things you said about Lana, and I loved Lana. Lana's 17. I mean, she had guts. And one of the things you said about her that I found very poignant was she felt she had a right to a revolutionary dream of human equality. Can you talk a little bit about that time after the revolution? What was in the air? What were people talking about? We all know what George Washington was doing and Thomas Jefferson, but you know, the folks that you write about, the working people.
Yeah, I think we often kind of lull ourselves into a kind of a comic book view of the American Revolution and the founding of the American nation, and kind of imagine that America became free and independent in 1776. I grew up in Concord, Massachusetts, where the big battle happened in 1775, so we quibble over the dates. And people like to think that the American Revolution transformed everything in America. And a lot of what we've learned from historians in recent years has been how conservative much of the revolution was, how many state governments really didn't change their state constitutions much, how many towns and cities didn't really change their charters or their systems of governance. But what is remarkable to me about this, and a lot of historians about the 1790s, is that the 1790s was a moment when there was a lot of change in the air. There was a real sense of possibility in the 1790s. So there was outpourings of a new kind of feminist consciousness coming out of Britain and France and the United States in the 1790s. And there was a major struggle that emerged in places like New York and then across the American nation about class and populism and who should be in charge of the government. And in New York particularly, I think the old Dutch and English elite that had been kind of running the city in the colonial period kind of assumed that after the revolution they would keep running the city. And in the 1790s, these Federalist elites were in fact running the city, and the mayor would call in the cartmen who he issued licenses to. So these are contractor tradesmen in the city, and he would issue their licenses, and he would tell them how he expected them to vote. And what was interesting is in the 1790s, they began to resent that. And part of this, I think, was the influence of the French Revolution, which offered a much more radical vision of republicanism and equality. And so New York became really on the vanguard of an effort to reimagine democracy in America in the 1790s in a much more egalitarian mode. And so when Noah Webster, for example, moved to New York City in the August of 1793, he was trying to found a conservative newspaper to counteract the radicals. He was horrified to hear people in the city streets singing the Marseillaise and chanting, "Down with King Washington." And that kind of class tension played into this trial because I think spectators of the trial and afterwards saw Lana Sawyer as members of a working family that were disparaged during the trial by the elite lawyers and defendant. And so the case took on not just a gender dynamic, but also a class dynamic, in which people felt that Lana was being dismissed unfairly for her obscure, that's a quote from one of the attorneys. One of the attorneys said that she's such an obscure person, and the witnesses on her behalf are such obscure people that they should have their own character witnesses. This was a lawyer who lived 2 doors down from Lana.
Talk about the trial a little bit. because I found it fascinating that you were able to find a complete written account of that trial by a British lawyer who'd come to New York. Am I correct about that?
Yeah,
Mr.
so
Wyche?
I call him Witch,
That's all right.
W-Y-C-H-E. I think there's a local family that has a different pronunciation. But so William Witch was a young attorney who was completing his legal training at Gray's Inn in London when he got involved in a duel. And he got involved in a duel because he was walking down the street, not unlike Harry Bedloe, and he saw a woman being mistreated by a gentleman, and he intervened, and the gentleman challenged him to a duel to avenge the insult to his honor. Are you with me? Mm-hmm. Dueling was then illegal, and both of them, these individuals, were bad shots, but on the third round, Witch shot the other guy in the shoulder. And that made the newspapers, which meant that Witch had to leave the country to avoid prosecution for for shooting the guy. So he moved to New York to avoid. So it's an interesting story with these crazy parallels. At the time, he got a job working for a prominent New York attorney who did a lot of transatlantic business work, and and this attorney's son was actually under arrest out on bail, but had been charged with rape in Queens County 6 months earlier. So I think William Witch went to this trial both thinking, oh, he needed to pay attention because his boss's son was facing a similar charge, and they would need to know how to do a defense, and also because I think in some ways he was unsympathetic to Bedloe, who had been pretending to be the gallant gentleman, but it turned out to be the predator. And he came from London, which had a much more sophisticated legal culture than America. London was a city of like 1 million people at the time. New York was like 40,000. So part of what Witch wanted to do in New York was bring some English-style legal scholarship to America. He was working on a manual of the practice of law, which if you don't know what it is, don't worry. But it proved very influential when he published it. And he thought an entree to that would be to create an English-style report of this rape trial. I'll tell you the after story of that, and then we'll maybe get to the trial if Jennet wants to hear. Jennet wants to get to the trial, but it turned out that the report was so unflattering to so Bedloe's family. Bedloe had this rich family that hired 6 of the best attorneys in town. So we had this kind of dream team of lawyers. And when they heard that a report was going to be published in which their arguments were going to be summarized, they were horrified. And they prevailed upon Witch to pull it from the press and not to publish it. They published a preemptive letter into the newspaper saying, he's about to publish this thing and none of it's true and he's totally wrong and he doesn't quote us properly, because they were so embarrassed that their tactics in court were going to be revealed in print. And actually what happened was that other people wrote back into the paper saying, like, you said you didn't say that, but oh yes you did. And so that strategy kind of backfired on these attorneys, but Witch had kind of made himself a persona non grata among a large segment of New York's legal elite. And he ended up giving up on New York and moving to Charleston.
Yeah. I picked up on that. I thought it was great. Of course, we don't know where he ended up, but, well, you do know a little bit about it. But let's talk about the trial, because I think that some of the precedents were set for future legal proceedings in this area of rape. And I know you go into a lot about the tactics that the defense used, which were primarily lies. And of course, Lana had to testify. And if nothing else, get the book to read about her testimony. I mean, you have to see her in this huge room at Federal Hall, correct? Probably with dozens and dozens of people, and she's up there and she's testifying and she has to say exactly what happened. And you do go into a wonderful story about her gown. How was that used as, I guess, forensic evidence?
Let's pause the gown and do the trial first.
Okay, fine.
So I suppose the thing I wanted to say about the trial is that the official, I'll just say, the legal history part of this project made me anxious and nervous, and I did my best, and I consulted with people. But I was presenting this summer to a room full of, it was the 50 chief justices of the 50 states. And I was like, oh my God. And I was talking to them because the trial, reading the trial and then trying to research the trial it's kind of dizzying. It's got a kind of, it reads kind of hallucinatory, and then it makes you feel like you're losing it's like feeling vertigo. It was because there was a very simple legal definition of sexual assault, rape in this period. And in fact, it was an ancient statute. The statute was written in 1285. And it defined rape as the carnal knowledge of a woman against her will, period. There's a section about if she's under, of statutory rape of a younger girl. But the basic definition was about consent, carnal knowledge of a woman against her will. But over time, a series of legal commentaries about the criminal law had been published, and the most famous of them, and kind of the most openly misogynistic of them, was Lord Hale's Commentaries on the Laws of England, his Pleas of the Crown, which was written in the 1670s before he died, and then published 50 years after his death in 1736. And he's been in the news a lot because he's been quoted in the Supreme Court recently, and he's still an active figure in understanding the history of the law. But he was very skeptical in rape cases of the testimony of women. And so he suggested in his commentary on the law, which was not the law itself, it's just somebody's opinions about the law, he wrote that because women are so malicious by nature and so inclined to vengefulness and so likely to lie, it's a problem that a rape case depends on the testimony of the survivor. And so he suggested a series of tests that could be used. He called them circumstantial evidence that could be used to evaluate the credibility of the claimant in the prosecutrix in a rape case. And so he gave these. They were not requirements. They were simply, in his view, I'm trying to defend Lord Hale, which seems crazy. But for him, they were methods of evaluating credibility. And so one of them was she of good fame? That is to say, did she have a good reputation? Did she report the crime while it was recent? Did she have marks of violence on her body or on her clothing? Did the defendant flee? There were 4 or 5 questions he posed. And Lana Sawyer's stepfather, so she told her family what happened, and her stepfather took her to a private attorney to write up a written declaration of complaint before they went to city officials, which was very unusual and interesting. And clearly what would have happened there is that this, and in fact I bought that attorney's, his name was Caleb Riggs. I bought his copy of the main English criminal law manual at the time. So I'm sure he was looking at this book while she was talking to her. So the tests were like, does Lana have a good reputation? Answer, yes. She clearly had an excellent reputation for modesty and prudence and virtue. Did she report the crime while it was recent? Yes, clearly she reported the crime within a week officially and told her parents very quickly after the incident. Did she have signs of violence on her body? Yes, there was testimony from her mother and her aunt that she'd been bloodied, and her gown was torn, which we can get to in a minute. So I think Lana went into the trial, I think, thinking that she actually had a strong case, and that even though Lord Hale had suggested these extra hurdles she needed to overcome, that she didn't have any trouble passing those tests. But what happened in the trial was extraordinary, because the defense attorneys working for Bedloe kept misquoting Hale. And so they would say, Hale says that a rape case is not valid unless it's reported immediately. And you're like, Hale did not say that. He did not say that it wasn't valid unless something happened. And he said you should use that to evaluate the credibility, but not that it invalidates the case. And then he didn't say it had to be reported immediately. He said while it was recent. Like, what's the definition of recent? Who knows? That's arguable, but immediate is not the same as recent. Are you with me? So there was all this sleight of hand in the lawyers' arguments and presentations in court in which they kept misquoting the authorities they claimed to be quoting. And I kept trying to find the quote, and I can't find the quote, and I'm like, they're just lying. So that was crazy for me. I was like, that's bizarre. How did they get away with that? And then on the question of character, it was really horrifying to see what they did, because on the question of character, they said, of reputation, what they said was, well, it's apparent that among these obscure people, she has an acceptable reputation. But the issue is not really whether she has a good reputation, because who knows what passes for a good reputation among these people. The question is, does she have a good inner character? Now, the reason Hale didn't talk about inner character is it's impossible to establish inner character in a court of law, right? Like God, maybe, the confessional, maybe, I don't know. But like a court of law, who can provide testimony about your inner character? So they spent hours speculating about how bad Lana's inner character might possibly be. And so they said things like, perhaps, even though she pretends and presents a front of virtue and innocence, how do we know that she's not harboring dark desires? So they not only disparaged her as having dark desires, but also made it seem like she was trying to pull the wool over the eyes of the jury by having a good reputation. So that was a fascinating part of the trial, and I talked to these Supreme Court justices. I'm like, this seems so crazy to me. How do they get away with it? And they're like, welcome to the law. So this was a case, I think, that had profound effects. We know that during this period, the law, late 18th century, early 19th century, the law of rape really shifted in America, and stranger rape prosecutions got separated out from acquaintance rape prosecutions, and acquaintance rape prosecutions became very difficult to pursue in court. So we see that whole huge segment of sexual assaults kind of got cleaved from what was legally prosecutable. And we've known that has happened, and that it still remains a huge problem for victims of sexual violence. But this case shows how that happened in a courtroom, and one of the major precedents that encouraged that development over time.
The gown.
So I spent a lot of time trying to visualize aspects of this story. What did Mother Carey's back room look like? What were the texture of the walls? Just so you know, they were rough planks, not plastered and lathed and plastered. So I did know that. But I wanted to know what Lana was wearing and what her clothing looked like. And in the trial record, there are a few details. It says she was wearing a calico gown with a drawn frill about the neck, and that when it had been taken off, Lana says it was torn off of her. The pins, ouch. When it was torn off, the pins came out, and 2 or 3 strings were torn off of it. And so I was looking for a gown that involved pins, calico, a drawn frill, and strings. And what I found was that it was very difficult to establish what a 1793 gown for a 17-year-old would have looked like. Because the 1790s were in the midst of a huge transformation in women's fashion. We went from the kind of classic 18th century funnel-shaped gowns with a big skirt and then a tight waist and funnel-shaped bodice that were classic in the Revolutionary period. So any colonial portraits you've seen have that profile. And then we're moving towards the Empire style, Queen Antoinette's chemise gowns, very flowing, loosely constructed, often diaphanous gowns you see in Jane Austen movies. Are you with me?
Yeah.
But in 1793, fashion historians don't pay much attention to 1793 because it's in the middle and they don't like, examples that aren't classic on one end or the other. So there was really no way of knowing exactly what the gown was like except to think about the way it was constructed. And this gown clearly had a fitted bodice, which if you were not rich, would have been pieced together, held together with straight pins. And they didn't stab you because you had a shift on underneath, and then you had a corset, which was made out of wood it was sturdy corset underneath. So that protected you from the pins. And the pins were able to do the work because the corset's what held your upper body in place. So you could breathe and not pop your pins out. And then the gown was either petticoats and the gown either tied together around your waist in one way or another. Anyway, I was trying to figure this out, and I was looking at fashion histories, and I consulted with various experts. Kimberly Alexander was one, Laura Johnson was another, but my most crazy experience was at Colonial Williamsburg, where I met with Linda Baumgarten, who's kind of the great expert on 18th century clothing. And she graciously agreed to meet with me and walk me through this. And she was very patient. And I was explaining to her all the little pieces of evidence. There were 3 strings or 2 strings, and there was these straight pins and calico and drawn frill. And she's showing me the fashion books. I'm like, yeah, I looked at that one. She's drawing me pictures, and she said, this is probably what the gown was. It probably was a round gown, which means it was made in one piece and all sewn together and had a drop panel. And that's the gown that's illustrated in the book, is kind of. And she said it's probably printed because it's easier to keep clean than white. But she could have been wearing white, which was increasingly fashionable. And I was like, oh, great. And she wrote me these little sketches on Post-it notes, which I still have and I treasure. And I thought, all right, we're done. And then she said, but John, that's not really what's interesting about this. And I thought, oh. And she said, so I said, what is interesting about the gown? And she said 2 things. One is the fact that there's testimony in the trial that Harry Bedloe pulled the gown off Lana Sawyer. And she says, that's interesting because it shows something about his sexual aim. So in the 18th century, people didn't wear underwear in the modern sense. So they wore petticoats or a shift or a long shirt. But there was you weren't wearing pantyhose, you weren't wearing panties, you weren't wearing tights, you weren't wearing briefs, you weren't wearing boxers. Are you with me? So in order to have sex, you didn't need to disrobe. He could have pulled up her skirts, pulled down the drop front of his pants, and had sex. So the fact that he wanted Lana naked is a sign that he had a very specific idea of the sex act he was interested in, which had to do with her body being exposed, her being vulnerable in a particular way. So that's a matter, of speculation, but about what exactly that tells us. But it tells us something. And then she said, the fact that the gown was torn tells us that he tore it. It tells us that this encounter was violent, because she wouldn't. It's unimaginable that she would have torn her own gown, taking it off. In this period, the labor of a young woman like Montessori was very cheap, but the fabric itself was expensive for somebody like her. And so if she had been in a fit of passion, she would not have been tearing her T-shirt down the middle. She would have been dismantling her garment the way it's meant to be dismantled. And that actually made sense because the gown was the only piece of forensic evidence introduced at the trial. They brought the gown, the torn and repaired gown, into the courtroom, clearly as evidence that I think the woman in the room understood was meant to be signs that the assault had been violent. So that was the story of the gown.
It's a wonderful story, absolutely wonderful. The other piece of this story that I think you might want to go into a little bit is what happened after the trial. What was the public response to the trial?
So one of the fascinating things to me about the 18th century is that newspapers didn't report criminal matters the way they do now. So there was no mention. So Janet was asking me the other day, how did people know about this trial? Because the courtroom was packed. It was a big room built to house the U.S. House of Representatives, designed by Pierre L'Enfant when New York City was the U.S. Capitol, recycled as a courtroom afterwards. How do people know? And that was one set of questions. So we have this packed courtroom, but there's nothing in the newspapers that a trial is coming, that an indictment has been handed down. And even after the trial, there was no report for almost a week. And even then, there was no mention of this trial. There was a mention of the other individuals who had been tried during that session of the court who had been convicted. So only people which were a bunch of forgers, were convicted, and then they were hanged. But a week after the trial, the newspapers exploded because on the Monday following the trial, which was a Wednesday, the Monday following, a huge crowd, as many as 600 men, gathered at dark and proceeded to tear down Mother Carey's house. And in good 18th century fashion, they operated like a classic 18th century mob, like your Tea Party kind of mobs, where they were not violent against people. There was a gunshot fired from inside the house. Some people said Mother Carey was using her musket. But the crowd focused on damaging symbolic property. And they went methodically over the course of the night, they went about dismantling the house from shingles all the way down to smashing all the furniture so they couldn't be accused of looting. And they left in the morning a cloud of bed feathers and some scraps of kindling that poor people were hauling away. In fact, over the course of that night and the next night, something like a dozen brothels in New York City were torn down. And then a newspaper debate emerged over the legitimacy of these riots. Because the city fathers, the mayor, and others said, oh, we can't have rabble running around rioting, attacking private property. And the rioters said, well, if you people can't hold people accountable for their crimes, what do you don't make us enforce the law ourselves. You do your job, Mr. Magistrate. You uphold the law. And then women writers started writing in saying, like, well, it's understandable why the mayor and his friends, who seem to spend too much time in brothels, are anxious about their continued existence, but perhaps they should spend more time with their wives and families. And perhaps we should have a city in which a young woman can walk down the streets in safety. Is that too much to ask? So that became a vitriolic debate, and portions of that debate were published in newspapers from Charleston up into New England, into Vermont.
I'm
so
proud
this
of those women for writing those letters.
And yeah, some of what was most interesting to me was, one basic set of questions was like, who are all these men? Like, how did the working men of New York come to find this assault on Lana Sawyer and assault upon them? So there was kind of that angle, which to me was kind of surprising. And then there was this question of who are these women writing in the newspapers with pretty forceful arguments about sexual double standards and the right, arguments similar to Title IX arguments about college campuses, as about, which are the basic Title IX claim regarding colleges has been that everybody deserves a safe learning environment and an environment in which they can go to college without being worried about being raped. And that's a fundamental matter of human equality.
And you also write in the book that there was a virulent anti-feminism embedded in American democracy.
So, yes, these women writers got castigated by elites in the city at the time. So so these two women called themselves Mariah and Justicia, and men wrote back in the newspapers attacking them, arguing that they were essentially public women for writing in public. And you even saw that in the choice of targets during the riots. There's clearly a kind of outrage. I think John Callanan, Lana's stepfather, helped organize the riots. And the defense attorneys and Bedloe's family were afraid that their houses were going to be targeted. But in fact, the rioters did not attack the Bedloe house, which was, they had guards protecting it, and Bedloe had fled from the city. But the rioters focused on brothels. And they focused not just on brothels, but brothels run by women. So we have this kind of classic displacement maneuver in which the rioters are angry about class resentments and the way in which the city's elites had treated working men during the trial, working people during the trial. But instead of acting out against the men with whom they had grievances, they acted out against women that they deemed sexually disorderly. So there's a kind of so I kind of was rooting for the rioters, but also disappointed by the rioters.
Yeah, exactly. What happened to Mother Carey?
Mother Carey testified for Harry Bedloe during the trial, and a lot of her testimony was pretty clearly lies. The question was, why did you let these people into your establishment? There was this kind of crazy series of back and forth among the attorneys because the prosecution was saying, excuse me, you say that Lana Sawyer is too disreputable to be reliable, and yet you are relying on the testimony of, one, an admitted perjurer, and two, a brothel keeper. So make up your mind. So she was roundly attacked in the newspapers during these riots, and she eventually was effectively run out of business in New York. She moved to Philadelphia and died a few years later. She left a substantial estate, so she was a good business person. She made a good living. And she ordered in her will that she have a large marble stone engraved with her name erected. And so she's buried in Christ Church Cemetery in downtown Philadelphia. You may have visited it because it's the graveyard near Independence Hall in Philadelphia where Benjamin Franklin's buried. And if you remember, Benjamin Franklin has this big, what's it called, ledger stone, table stone, flat stone on the ground. And Mother Carey has exactly the same stone 100 yards away. So she actually looks like a founding father.
Very good. But, Harry got his eventually.
Harry, there's a whole drama and follow-up to the rape trial. Harry Bedloe ended up being sued in civil court by Lana's family. And almost a year to the date after the rape trial, in the same courtroom, he was found responsible. And very substantial money damages were awarded to Lana's family. His very wealthy family declined to bail him out. And John Callanan, Lana's stepfather, was a pugnacious individual and chose to have Henry locked up in debtor's prison. So Henry Bedloe did spend almost 2 years locked up in debtor's prison. What his family did do for him was they hired the best attorney in the nation on financial matters to get him out of debtor's prison. And that's how Alexander Hamilton enters the story as the attorney, having just retired as Secretary of the Treasurer. Hamilton returned to New York, and one of the jobs he took was trying to get Bedloe out of debtor's prison.
Good one.
Which he pursued through all kinds of fraudulent and repugnant methods. Just saying.
You've mentioned a couple times the whole issue of class when it came to this particular case. Were fallen women really fallen?
Yeah, I don't know how much in the way of Susanna Rosen and 18th century seduction stories you all have read recently. But I'm sure many of you have an image in your mind of Lydia Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, who is effectively seduced by Wickham. Are you with me? And the family faces ruin because a respectable woman who loses her virginity is understood to be fallen, destroyed, a social outcast. And that's consistent with the messaging that young women were faced with in early America, particularly in the 1780s, 90s, early 19th century, was this idea that a young woman who agrees to have sex with a man outside of marriage is doomed. They called her ruined or fallen. All of these stories have basically the same plot. Some charming gentleman comes along under false pretenses, pretends to be interested in her. There's always some older woman who has some malicious intent who assists the rake accomplish his seduction. She agrees to run off with him. He has sex with her and abandons her. Often she's pregnant and abandoned. Sometimes she's just abandoned. Her family disowns her. She dies in poverty. Sometimes she's alcoholic first. Sometimes she's a prostitute first. But she always dies. And so it's a very powerful cultural script, and it's not unlike the way we have very extreme cultural scripts in modern America about how young women and to some extent young men should comport themselves and the consequences that might follow. So I was really curious in this story to understand, and the defense attorneys used that. They said, oh, Lana knows she's ruined if she can't prove rape, so this is just a lie she made up to avoid being ruined. And so I was curious to know what actually happened to women who were in that situation. We know from studies of marriage dates and first birth dates that a very large percentage of women in colonial and revolutionary America were pregnant on their wedding days, something like a quarter. So there was a lot of premarital sex, but the key with premarital sex in that period was you wanted to be confident that the guy was actually going to marry you. So I looked at a series of cases of seduction suits in which the guy had gotten the woman pregnant on the assumption they were going to get married, and then had changed his mind and refused to marry her, leaving her pregnant and single. And what I found was interesting was that, one, women who filed seduction claims against men, this is civil damage, almost always won, basically always won. And until Lana Sawyer's case, they tended to get very small practical damages. So the amount of the cost of literal childbearing and childcare, et cetera, rather than punitive damages. But that if you tracked these women, which took a lot of genealogy, they had very good chances of getting, of having a pretty normal social life after that. At least half of the women that I was able to track got married. They married men from basically the same social standing as their families. So the fact was that and those were just the women I could follow. A lot of them I couldn't follow because they have names like Jane Smith, and you're like, oh my God. Like,
Another Smith, yeah.
But the point is that this idea, this cultural script of ruin, didn't really obtain in real life. Young women who got pregnant, even had sex before marriage, but even got pregnant and were single mothers, often didn't face social ruin. They were embraced and supported by their families in these cases, and they went on to live, different kinds of lives as wives and mothers.
Do we have time for just one last quick story about your literary agent?
Oh, yeah. Although I must say, this is not a story about my actual literary agent. This is about the literary agent who continually declined to represent this project. So my friend Debbie Applegate, who won the Pulitzer Prize for biography 20 years ago for a wonderful book on a sex scandal, connected me with her agent, who's a famous agent, Susan Rabiner, who's wrote a great book on writing nonfiction, which I read and enjoyed and benefited from. And so when I was thinking of telling this story as a narrative, I contacted Susan, and she said, well, send me a proposal. So I sent her a proposal, and she writes these very terse emails. She said, call me. So I sent her this proposal, and she said, call me, so I called her. And she said, John, you said you wanted to tell a story. This is not a story. This is this thing, and happened, and this thing happened, and this thing happened, and this thing happened. That's a bunch of things that happened. Try again. So I was depressed and basically incapable of doing anything for a while. And then I scraped myself off the floor, and I developed a new scheme for the book and a new outline of chapters and a new proposal, and I sent it to Susan, and she wrote back, call me. And I called her, and she said, John, I know you want to write a story, and this is more of a story, but it's a horrible story. Nobody wants this story. It's a terrible story. Try again. So I finally basically wrote the book, wrote a new proposal, sent it to her. She said, call me. I called her, and she said, John, I'm a big agent. When I talk to people, I'm talking to the big editors at the big houses, and they expect a big project from me. And this is a small project. So I see you've done a lot of work, and you've made a lot of progress trying to tell a story. But basically, my giant fingers are too big to pick up your tiny project. So Susan, actually, I'm very grateful to her, and I have friendly relationship with her to the present. But so she did a lot to shape the book through tough love.
Thank you. It's a great story. Do we have time for any questions?
Yeah, I think we have one or two.
Where are the microphones? There's a lady here who raised her hand.
There's a lady back there.
Oh, sorry.
Go here.
Thank you so much. I'm trying to get my an understanding of the motivation for the trial, given the class differences, and did the stepfather have political ambitions? Clearly, he had leadership qualities. Why did they go to this, and did they? I don't understand that.
All right, so the question is, why did they pursue a rape charge, given the disparity between Lana's social standing and the Bedloe family, and the obstacles they faced? And it's a good question. Then, there are estimates that today something like 85% of acquaintance rapes go unreported, because survivors decide that it's not worth the potential risks or obvious challenges of trying to pursue recourse. And the 1790s were really no different. So there are a couple things. I think that part of it is simply that Lana had a very strong sense of her own entitlement to justice and to recourse. I think there was something in her where she felt that a sense of like, I matter, what happened to me matters, and I want to stand up for myself. And it was unusual. Lana was also very good at persuading people, winning people over. So she had both a kind of determination and a kind of skill. The other quality, I'm going to get back to skill in a second. We may be here all night. But Lana also came from a family that was easy to underestimate. She came from a family that was, to the appearances, kind of artisanal, skilled workers, but manual work. Her father had been a carriage maker and wheelwright. Her stepfather was a branch pilot. So these were kind of working men, but skilled. Her grandmother had owned at least two houses in the neighborhood where Lana was living in the 1790s, before the Revolution. So at a time when most New Yorkers, like most New Yorkers now, couldn't afford to buy, she had multiple houses. And Lana's aunt was actually rich. So the day after the assault, Lana spent the afternoon with her aunt, and her aunt lived with an even richer widow. So these two widows lived together. And the even richer widow was Alexander Hamilton's aunt. As you may know from the Hamilton story, she was the aunt of this Eliza Schuyler. So she was on the money side of that marriage. So Lana had entree into the halls of power in Manhattan. Her uncle had been an alderman, who was one of the officials who heard criminal complaints. So I think part of it is Lana had a family background that gave her more of a sense of access to justice than would have appeared just by looking at her and where she lived. But she also had personal qualities that clearly made her very persuasive, because then, as now, in order to pursue a charge of sexual assault, there were a whole series of gatekeepers that she had to pass through and convince. And I think that's why they went to this private attorney first, but she had to talk to her parents, she had to get her parents' backing, she had to get her father's backing, because in practical terms, you couldn't prosecute a sexual assault without the man of the house behind you. She went to the mayor to file the complaint, and it was up to the mayor either to believe her. The mayor conducted his own investigation before deciding to turn it over to the attorney general. The attorney general had to decide whether to present it to a grand jury. The grand jury had to decide. So there are all these hurdles she had to pass, and she was clearly very compelling.
Does that answer your question? Yeah. We have one more right back there. Yeah.
Okay, so we are a little over time, so if you do
Yeah.
need to leave, feel free to just slip out, but we're going to close out with one final question.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's a short one. The book is great. I loved it. Is it going to be made into a movie?
That was
I think it would be fabulous.
Thank you. I hope so. Who knows?
you were great.